very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and at this important event, and I look forward to exchanging ideas and suggestions with you. Let me tell you, first of all, where I come from, so it's quite clear what I'm going to focus on, which is a slightly different point of view from the talk we've heard before. I'm lucky enough to work in Edinburgh, which is one of the international hubs for interdisciplinary research on bilingualism and multilingualism and language learning. I'm an experimental linguist by training, but I work with many people in different fields because I think that all the important questions in these fields need bridges across fields. They need interdisciplinary work. And so we're very lucky to do that in Edinburgh. And in Edinburgh, we work on bilingualism in a broad sense. So for us, bilingualism means more than one. So it includes multilingualism, of course, across the lifespan. So in children who learn 2 languages from birth, children who learn one language first and then another, adults who learn a foreign language as young adults, and increasingly older adults who are exposed to another language later in life. So in all these cases, we're interested in what it means to have more than one language in the brain. So what I'm going to talk about is focused on the linguistic and cognitive facets of multilingualism. I'm also the director of a center called Bilingualism Matters, where we try to bring research to people in very different sectors of society. We work with families, we work with educators and teachers, we work with policymakers, we work with health professionals and businesses. So we want to make research accessible to people so that they can use them in their personal or professional decisions. And we've grown a lot over the last 10 years. I started 10 years ago, and now we have 26 branches all over the world in 3 continents, including North America and China. So we have the opportunity to exchange ideas about good practices, realities, about multilingualism over the world. Now, let's start from why are we here? Obviously, this panel is focused on the challenges of having English as an international dominant language. There are 2 types of challenge. One is in the so-called Anglosphere, where English is either the main language or the official language. And in the UK, where I live and work, people often think, what's the point of learning another language? Everybody speaks English, right? In fact, this is not even true, because if we look at this map of Europe, you see that the darker the green, the more people speak English. And of course, Great Britain is very dark, as you can imagine. But if you look at the shade of the green, moving south, to Southern Europe, it gets lighter and lighter. It's simply not true that everybody speaks English. So that's not a very good reason not to learn other languages. Now, clearly, the Brits are very proud of having English, and this is a statement from William Hague, who used to be Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs a few years ago, and he says, we have some immense assets and advantages in the area of relations between nations, international courts of public opinion, and international negotiation tables. For example, the English language connecting us to billions of people, right? And as my colleague said before, we shouldn't underestimate the advantages of having a language that allows us to communicate among people. But we'll look at the disadvantages as well. The disadvantage of what I would call privileged monolingualism in the UK, for example, is very, very visible in terms of language skills. So the UK still has the worst language skills among all countries in the European Union. And this comes at a very big cost for the economy. That's not my figures. The figures are well documented. 48 billion a year that the UK has to lose for lack of language skills. Now, in the world, the challenge is obviously the fact, as we said before, that English is by far the most common studied foreign language in the world, and we've already seen figures, so we won't spend much time on this. And we have different attitudes, you know. I mean, I'm just talking about the extremes here. One extreme came just last week from Quebec, where a French citizen was denied an application for immigration for settled status because she had written a chapter in English in her thesis. And that chapter happened to be a published paper in an international journal. We said before, English is the international language of academia, and so it's very common. If you want to be read, you published in English. And that chapter ended up in her thesis, and that was seen as a reason to deny her immigration status. Now, at the opposite extreme, we have Italy, which is a country that I come from, where I was born and raised, where English is everywhere. English has penetrated into the political language, for example, to an extent that is almost amazing. So, for example, you read on the headlines, spending review, mancano 4 miliardi, or unioni civili, stepchild adoption, or Jobs Act, etc., etc. It's interesting that in many cases people can't even pronounce these terms very well, never mind understand them, but there is some feeling that if you say this in English, it sounds better. And that is something that I find quite extreme in a European context. Now, I want to tell you why we think that multilingualism is good and why we're trying to get this message across to people in different sectors of society. So why is multilingualism good for you? And I would like to say now, not in all cases and not all the time. We'll come back to this, so it's not that multilingualism is magic and gives you benefits no matter what, because we know that there are cases in which the benefits don't appear. I'll come back to this. Clearly, it's not the case that bilingualism makes you more intelligent, okay? And this is unfortunately something that you tend to find. There's a kind of exploitation of the research on the benefits of bilingualism by people who want to sell you stuff, on the assumption that, this makes your child more intelligent or smarter, or you can turn your child into a genius, which simply know that this is not true. So, what are the benefits of bilingualism from a linguistic and a cognitive point of view over the lifespan? Obviously, I don't have time to go into great detail. First of all, the fake news, as I said, and this is, again, things that you find, more and more in the press. So this is, this is unbelievable. So learning a new language stimulates the same pleasure centers in the brain as sex and chocolate, or, look at that, bilingual is sexy, or people who are bilingual, well, they're more attractive and so on. And you find this and more. So clearly, I want to make clear that these are fake news. So what are the real news? So the real effects on language skills, for example, is that bilingual children, and again, I mean bilingual in a broad sense, not bilingual from birth, not perfect in both languages, because the perfect bilingual doesn't exist, but a bilingual child has a natural understanding of how language works, because their brain deals with more than one language, and so clearly below their level of consciousness, they can't articulate this knowledge, but they understand how language works better. And that can apply also to the language of schooling. There are many people who worry that a child who comes from a different language background, if they go to school in English, they're not going to do so well. But there are an increasing number of studies that actually show a better understanding of the structure of English as well, or whatever the language of schooling is. That also means better language skills. If you have 2 or more than 1 language in your brain, learning a 3rd language or a 4th language is easier. Now, effects outside language, for example, and this is important for something that I'm going to say later, perspective-taking. That means that bilingual children developmentally have an advantage in understanding that other people can have a different point of view from their own. So a different perspective from their own. And they do this because they understand very early on that not everybody is bilingual, so they have to choose the right language depending on who they're talking to. And this is expanded and reflected outside the domain of language, leading to a better appreciation that other perspectives are possible, other points of view are possible. And this is also, it has been found in adults who are ready faster to move from their own perspective to appreciate another person's perspective. Now, it's hard to overestimate the importance of this in today's society. There are also benefits that have been found for the way we pay attention and the flexibility that we have of in moving from one task to another. So better control of attention means ability to focus attention on what matters, at the same time ignoring or disregarding what doesn't matter. And again, this is something that we need in our everyday life. It's not just language, it's everything we need that requires selective or focused attention and ability to control potential distractions. So the ability to handle conflicting information, this is something that comes from being bilingual, because being bilingual means having simultaneously active languages in your brain. So when you speak one, you have to exclude the others all the time. You can't switch off a language in the morning and put it in the drawer because we don't need it today. So I'm speaking English to you, but my Italian is very much alive, as well as the other languages I speak, and my brain is actively trying to push them away. Again, this experience is overgeneralized outside the language domain and leads to a better general control of attention. There are effects that have been found on decision-making, still controversial. I mean, none of these effects are uncontroversial, right? I mean, I really need to say this. And they don't happen in every single context. But what we see is that either there is a difference or there is no difference between, say, bilinguals and monolinguals. But where there is a difference, the difference tends to be in favor of the bilingual and multilinguals. So, decision-making, making a decision in a second language seems to be imply controlling heuristic biases that are based on emotional reactions. So this has led to conclusions about more rational decisions in bilinguals, particularly if decisions are made in a second language compared to decisions made in the first language. We are doing quite a lot of work on this in Edinburgh. But the main message that is coming out of this kind of research is that it doesn't matter which languages we're talking about. So it's the fact of having more than one language in the brain that matters, but not how many people speak these languages, how prestigious they are from a socio-economic point of view, and so on and so forth. So from this point of view, there are no more useful or less useful languages, and this is the kind of message that we are trying to convey in different sectors of society. And there are, as you know, implications for all kinds of sectors. For example, language learning in schools, or migration and multilingual societies, regional minority languages that have been mentioned, and wider benefits for cultural relations and businesses. I'm going to say just a few words about each of these points. For example, we did a study on learning Chinese in schools. So we did a lot of work with the Scottish government to introduce languages in schools. And their policy started in 2014, so very, very recently. First language introduced at age 5, second language introduced at age 10. There are lots of questions that still have to be faced. But, how much Chinese can a child learn if they are exposed to Chinese 1 hour a week, which is the typical exposure time? And we looked at a bunch of schools in Scotland, and the questions were, did children learn any Chinese? Yes, they learn some, okay? They don't become fluent magically because they are children, but they learn some. Does exposure to Chinese benefit some metalinguistic awareness in English? Yes, it does. We found evidence of that. Were there any cognitive effects of the kind that I mentioned before for general cognition in children? Yes, there were some, but these effects were much more visible in schools that actually allowed A, for more time, so more than an hour a week, and B, exposure to more than one speaker. So not just the teacher, who may not know Chinese very well, but also a native speaker of Chinese. And we, in Edinburgh, we train native speakers of Mandarin, students who are native speakers of Mandarin, to go into primary schools and work with the teacher to do their activities in their language. And that is apparently very beneficial for children. Now, multilingual classrooms. Multilingual classrooms are regarded, by many people as a problem, but in fact, we and other people have found through an EU-funded project that we compared, we had every child in multilingual classrooms learn Spanish as a foreign language. That was a new language for everybody, so there were no native speakers of Spanish in the classroom, and we had very multilingual classrooms, more than 50% of children from other language backgrounds, and compared to less multilingual classrooms, where only 5% or less were from other classrooms, we gave Spanish language tests as well as cognitive tests, and what we found was that a greater number of multilingual children passed the language, the Spanish test, and the cognitive tests, despite the fact that many of them were still learning English because they had come, at different times. And there was also an emerging trend, and this is very interesting, where the monolingual Scottish children actually performed better in more multilingual classrooms than in less multilingual classrooms. So it seems that being surrounded by children speaking other languages is actually very important, and in a sense prepares the brain for further language activities. This has been found in adults as well in a study that was published a few months ago by my colleagues in California, where they compared Americans who declared themselves as monolingual in California and in central Pennsylvania. Now, the difference between those two places is that California is multilingual, central Pennsylvania is not really. And so everybody had to learn Finnish, and you understand, how Finnish is a complex language, from most people. And then, their brain reactions were measured as well as their behavioral performance in tests, or how much Finnish had they learned. No difference in the behavioral test between Californians and Pennsylvanians, but the brain told a different story. So the brain of the Californians, who are exposed in a passive way, so they overhear other languages all the time, was actually more similar to the brain of a bilingual, even if the behavior hadn't followed yet. So it seems, compared to the brain of the Pennsylvanians, where there was very little trace of change, from monolingual. So it seems that even passive exposure to multilingual societies can prepare the brain for better learning, which is something that we need more research on, but it's very encouraging. The implications for the home languages in migrant families. We work a lot with refugees organizations, multilingual, families who come from different countries. I'm a migrant myself, but I'm a privileged migrant. Some people don't have, the privilege of education, high knowledge of English, and so on. So we think that maintaining the home language is not an obstacle to the successful integration, both from a social point of view and from a linguistic point of view. Many parents feel under pressure to stop speaking their language because they think that they can help the integration of their child. And we try to persuade them with arguments, right? We talk to them about research that is a disadvantage. It's a disadvantage for family communication as well, as you can imagine, but definitely it doesn't help the child's acquisition of the main language, the language of the community. But there are also challenges that, we can't ignore. My point is that if we know what the challenges are, we can face them better. We can talk about them. We can try to find solutions. Regional minority languages, we work on a variety of regional minority languages or indigenous minority languages, only spoken in certain places. In Scotland, we work on Gaelic, which happens to be the most supported minority language. It's not the only one, but it's the most supported minority language. In Italy, I work a lot on Sardinian because it's also in my roots. My mother was from Sardinia. She never spoke Sardinian to me because, as we'll see, what is the point? That's what many people think. So these languages are under threat because they are perceived as not useful or interfering with the majority language, but also because they are perceived as competing with English as the language that ought to be learned. So in Sardinia, we know, for example, that there are lots of people who say, why should I speak Sardinian to my child? They have to learn English. This is what my mother thought. And the idea that, if you learn Sardinian, you can't learn English well. I've just mentioned that if you have more than one language, you can actually learn languages faster and better. So that's what I was saying. A child who speaks Sardinian can't speak Italian well. Prejudice number one. A child who speaks Gaelic is not very good at English, and that underestimates the fact that when two languages are in contact, they inevitably affect each other. This is an area of research that we do. It's called attrition. My colleague Monica Schmidt, who's coming later, will be talking about this in more detail. But this means that, we can't expect a bilingual to be the sum of two monolinguals because two languages actually change each other in very subtle ways. It doesn't mean loss. It doesn't mean that the language goes down the drain. But it means that proficient bilinguals are not like monolinguals in either language. And the brain is not a chest of drawers where you have, 3 drawers with limited space. So if you put Sardinian or Gaelic or whatever the minority language is there, then, there isn't enough space for English. Rubbish. I mean, the more languages a child knows, the better. And we know that, but people need to know that. Now, finally, there are implications. We've been working with professional spheres that can actually exercise some influence, on public opinion. And again, working in the UK, it means that professional spheres like cultural relations or businesses, English is the international language, right? So is multilingualism valued? Well, not really, so it should be valued more. So for cultural relations and cultural diplomacy, for example, we know that cultural relations is about intercultural dialogue among people, and we know that cultural diplomacy has to do with the relationship among governments, influenced by foreign policy and so-called soft power. So if cultural relations involve the mutual exchange of ideas and cultures among people without, understanding for the purpose of generating genuine goodwill and so on, well, remember, a better understanding of other points points of view. That is a fantastic advantage that comes from being multilingual that shouldn't be underestimated. And also understanding the specificity of cultural relations. I gave a talk in Germany a few months ago, organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where understanding cultural relations means understanding in part the wider history of countries. So not all cultural relations are the same, because, for example, there are differences between cultural relations in a German sense and cultural relations in a British sense. In the first case, cultural relations are much more strongly based on a sense of identity, history, and so on, compared to British cultural relations, which are much more individualistic, liberal, and less based on a strong, identity in historical terms. So understanding these cultural differences and these differences among types of cultural relations is very important. Soft power has been mentioned before, what is soft power? Well, we can understand it in general terms as the power to persuade people without coercion, without applying, or payment, without applying those methods. And so, we can say that multilinguals are potentially better at evaluating arguments when interacting with counterparts, understanding what might be attractive to others. And that has to do with the ability to cooperate, to negotiate, to compromise, which is, essential for these kinds of professions. These are just quotes, and I like the one on the right. Knowledge of EFL, so English as a foreign language, does not confer soft power on Anglophones, but on Europeans using it in interactions with monoglot American and English speakers. So yes, that is a very good point. Prioritizing, so, from Joseph Nye, the fact that we live in a world, with an explosion of information, a paradox of plenty, as he calls it, then, it becomes important to distinguish between valuable information from background clutter. So it becomes impossible to understand what becomes what should get priority and what doesn't have immediate priority. So businesses need multilingualism very much, not only because they can trade with more people, and obviously if they trade with particular countries, it's an advantage to know the language, but also because languages and multilingualism can bring specific cognitive advantages for business skills. So if you know more than, if you know multiple languages, you can actually do business better. And this is what we've been working on with partners. The Financial Times, I must say, is very supportive of this, and they wrote articles about this, they organized events where we were invited. So, to conclude, we need bridges across research, different fields, and from research to society. That's absolutely vital. And investing in multilingualism beyond English is very important, because in a way that people don't understand, both in the Anglosphere, because English is the dominant language and the native language in many cases, but also in the world more widely, where English is given priority at the expense of many other languages. So those languages are useful because it's the fact of having more than one language that matters, not which languages. And so from a cognitive point of view, all languages are good, and we should encourage them all. And we need to give the correct information to people so that they can make informed decisions about their children, about their students, about their patients, about their policies, and about their companies. And that's why, going back to Bilingualism Matters, that's why we exist, and that's what we are trying to do, and working in this wide international network means not only that we can pull research together from many different angles, but we can also pull expertise and in various sectors, and we can improve our communication strategies, and we can improve the way we communicate research to very different people so that they can make better decisions. I stop here. Any questions that you would like to ask? Those are the ways to get in touch with us, but I'm also here for the rest of the conference. Thank you.